This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome again to Katrina. You spoke up when you last spoke.
Years ago.
No use, virtually non-existent knowledge, but certainly it's not the first time, and it's very good to have you back because you continue to have, I suppose, a stellar research programme which people, I'm sure, would have seen in various places, not least on the web, and you've just published a new book which is there. So, over to you.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for everyone for coming. So this is kind of an unofficial book launch, but it's not really. The new book, for 1 month only, you can get for half price on the website. So it is a bit more reasonably priced at the moment, but you have to do it through Manchester University Press website. So if you're looking for a cheaper copy, but do encourage your libraries to buy a copy as well, because then it'll come out at a more reasonable price. And there is a companion website, which is protesthistory.org.uk, which has lots more material on it, lots of maps, lots of extra stuff that didn't make the final cut, and that's all free as well. Okay, so I thought I'd start with just giving a chronological narrative of the scope of the book and look a bit at legislation, and then I'm going to zoom into 1848 as a little case study, and then use that to explain where I'm going in terms of my theories about space and place, and with reference to influential thinkers about spatial history and capitalism. I'd start off really with the main kind of narrative chronology, which stretches from 1789 and the start of the French Revolution to 1848, the start of the Third French Revolution. But I'm looking at the impact of the ideas coming from France on British popular politics, and I've sectioned off each period. One can see that.
You'll need to move, move that very slightly, because you're currently...
I'll just break everything. Is that clear?
Yeah, okay, right. Thank you.
And the reason why I've chosen these dates mainly is because the historiography tends to work in chunks, and particularly for the history of popular politics in this period. There's a lot of works on the 1790s and the immediate impact of the French Revolution, and there's quite a bit of recent material on the 18-teens, the period after the end of the Napoleonic Wars to Peterloo, and there's also quite a lot on the 1840s in terms of Chartism and overnight socialists. I've tried to piece all of that together, and I think that it's important to look at this whole period from 1789 to 1848 as a continuum. So one of the main themes that I'm looking at is the continuities, both in terms of legislation and in terms of collective action across the era. So the 1790s I characterise as a period of royalist exclusion, where I'm talking about how people with reformist and radical views are essentially excluded from positions of public office, from places of meeting of the public sphere of newspapers. And this is done formally through legislation that I'll talk about in a minute, but also informally through pressure and through influence and through spies and all the things that go on under Pitt the Younger's regime. But I argue that essentially continues in terms of a loyalist reaction all the way to the end of Chartism. So whether it's under Pitt the Younger or Lord Liverpool or under Melbourne or later Prime Ministers, there's a central continuity of at least ideas which are essentially trying to prevent mass working class action, both in the form of the reform movement and in terms of trade union activity. What happens is that popular politics develops in reaction to that reaction. So from the end of the Napoleonic Wars, we see the rise of the mass platform movement, claiming public spaces, claiming the legal right to protest. The key turning point is Peterloo, and the 6 acts that follow. And I'll explain that when I talk about legislation in a minute why that is, but I certainly see that as a turning point. But you've got to look at the whole period to understand Peterloo. You have to see what has gone on in the 1790s as well as what goes on in the Chartist period. 1818 to 30 is an odd period because it's mainly focused on the War of the Unstamped and the popular press. Large-scale mass collective action actually focuses on trade union movement in that period. We have huge strikes in 1818, 1826. And it's the reform movement only really starts to kick off again, obviously, in the agitation for the Reform Bill from 1830. What I also talk about in the book in particular, which I think shapes both the nature of protest and the reform movements, is the fact that the new Whig Liberal regime from the 1830s onwards also moves the goalposts, if you like, and creates new geographies to contend with. First of all, the reform electoral districts, then the factory inspectorates, then the new Poor Law Board districts, and municipal corporations, and finally the new police districts. All these are new geographies of administration that collective action has to deal with in a way that it hadn't done before. And actually you end up then with the odd situation of Tory radicals, of Tories joining forces with radicals to fight this new Whig regime. And then finally, in the 1830s, 1840s, both Chartists and overnight Socialists, I think, eventually find the longevity and the financial stability to contest a lot of the changes that had happened and the long history of loyalist reaction. And they're able to both get elected onto local government, which I think is a hugely significant achievement, but also find new places to protest, new spaces in terms of the press, to challenge the restrictions that they met. Now, it's not success in complete terms because, as I've written about elsewhere, they have to eventually go out of town boundaries and go and have mass meetings up on moorland, for example, out of the jurisdiction of some of the more reactionary local governments. And there's more legislation, as I'll show you. But that's essentially the continuities that I see. And the question of what happens next is another one which I'll come to. But I don't think that you can understand any point of this period between 1789 and 1848 without looking at the whole period. And I think that the historiography, because of the nature of the way that history writing works in Britain today, I think we focus a bit too much into particular movements or particular decades without really understanding the wider context. So I'm arguing for continuity between the 1790s and 1848. I'm arguing for continuities in the reaction of loyalist or Tory or anti-radical governments, both local and national. And I'm arguing that we look at popular protest and popular politics as within a sort of concept of inclusion and exclusion. Who is in and who is out? Who is excluded or increasingly excluded from public space, civic government, national government, the public sphere of newspapers, pamphlets, and so forth. And who forms the public is another key theme. And often a lot of the political meetings revolve around people claiming to represent the voice of the people, or the voice of a town, or the voice of a particular interest group, and the contest of who's allowed to sign a petition, who's allowed to call for a meeting. Those are the points where popular politics conflicts, usually with elites. So I'll just point out that the historiographer, as I've mentioned already, quite often focuses on the 1790s, but particularly focuses on legislation to do with text and seditious writings and libel laws. And I felt that I needed to write quite a bit about the fact that there is quite a bit of legislation around public meeting and seditious meetings in this period. there's a list, if you can see it, of all the Seditious Meetings Acts that were passed in this period. The suspension of habeas corpus, which is something I'm still working on, which is the indefinite imprisonment of radicals without trial. Unlawful Societies and Combination Acts, which prohibit collective bargaining, trade union action, and various royal proclamations which are specifically directed at the Chartists in preventing them, firstly from meeting at night time, and secondly from meeting during the day. Now, historians who've talked about the seditious libel and textual restrictions and censorship, particularly Philip Harling, Clive Emsley, John Barrell and so forth, have put forward a kind of double-edged argument about those measures of repression. And they've argued that, on the one hand, this wasn't a reign of terror under Pitt the Younger or Lord Liverpool, because the number of prosecutions was relatively low. A lot of radicals were able to prove their innocence or prove the dodginess of the authorities in the courts. And actually, a lot of this legislation did have loopholes that enabled radicals to evade prosecution. But on the other hand, and particularly John Barrell argues that it's not necessarily the number of prosecutions that was important, it was the anxiety and the fear and the uncertainty that this legislation caused. I'd like to argue the same for the Seditious Meetings Acts. There's lots of loopholes in the Seditious Meetings Acts, particularly that you have to have more than 50 people to constitute a meeting. So if there were 49 of you, it was legal. You have to have the permission of 2 magistrates to call a meeting. Well, if you get that permission, then it's a legal meeting. So if you have sympathetic magistrates, and there are some, not many, but there are some, then also you can have a meeting. So there are loopholes. A lot of this legislation is time limited, so it only lasts 2 or 3 years. And again, the number of prosecutions under this legislation was relatively low. It's very hard to prosecute someone for a seditious meeting. Normally the magistrates use the Riot Act or disturbance of the peace to put down political meetings, because it's very difficult to work out what is seditious and what's not. So I'd like to argue also the Barrell line about the fact that this still nevertheless dissuades radicals from meeting, the fact that this legislation is on the books. But moreover, the people who take this legislation very seriously and actually enact the repression of the magistrates and local notables and the members of the pit clubs or the Reevesite societies or the Orange Lodges. There's a lot of Orange Lodges in the north of England, or defence associations, all these clubbable, gentlemanly clubs that emerge during this period of reaction. They're the ones who keep writing to the Home Office saying, can I arrest this person? Can I put down this meeting? Can I ban this meeting? Usually the Home Office says no. And to give Lord Sidmouth some credit, which I never thought I'd say that, he does actually, and he often consults with the law officers and says, actually no, it would be illegal to do that according to the letter of the law. The government are actually quite concerned, obviously, about public meetings, but there is a sense of maintaining law and order. There's still a deference to Magna Carta and the idea of the right to petition. It's the loyalist magistrates who've been drinking in the Orange Lodge the previous night who are really trying to push this, and we particularly see this in the lead up to Peterloo. And there's a continuity as well about loyalist leadership. I think historians of popular politics often look for continuities of radical leadership without remembering that in fact it's the fuddy-duddy country magistrates and the mine owners and manufacturers who are sitting on the town benches who remain the same all the way through this period. So good old Colonel Fletcher of Bolton, who is a bête noire of V.P. Thompson's Making English Working Class. He's around for a long time, and he's Deputy Grand Master of the Orange Lodge and a member of the Bolton Pit Club and a member of the Bolton Church and King Society, all this. And his mates, be it William Hutton, a miner, or Joseph Radcliffe, who goes over to live in Huddersfield, because they won't let him back into Lancashire, these are the people who are really pushing the loyalist repression, and these are the people who are actually shaping what's going on the ground, and saying no to meetings being held. But I will say that the 6 acts are quite important, and as I mentioned, that Peterloo, which, if you don't know, is the sort of attack by the yeomanry on a peaceful reform meeting led by Henry Hunt and Samuel Bamford and various other local leaders in Manchester in 1819. The government responds by actually passing quite heavy-handed legislation known as the 6 Acts in October and November 1819. And what the Seditious Meetings Act that's passed in effect does repeat some of the previous Seditious Meetings Act, but it does change the definition of what's regarded as seditious. Michael Lobban, who wrote quite an interesting article in Oxford Legal Studies History, or whatever that journal's called, argues that the lead up to Peterloo and the impact after Peterloo actually shifts both national and local governments' attitudes to sedition and the question of sedition. So following on from Philip Harland's argument about the fact that the government realises that prosecuting radical leaders for libel is ineffective, they move towards prosecuting for seditious meetings. Again, the number of prosecutions is still low, but the definition of the law changes so that it's now no longer, you don't need proof of sedition said on the stage, on the hustings. It's whether the intent was seditious and whether it causes terror to the peaceable inhabitants. And that's written into the legislation. So I've just put an extract, you can see it there. It's causing disturbance of the public peace to the great terror and danger of His Majesty's loyal and peaceable subjects. So, and this is played out in the trials of Henry Hunt and Samuel Bamford and the Peterloo radicals, but is particularly expanded in the trial of the Chartists in 1839, again for seditious meetings, in that it's no longer, the government's no longer trying to prove that they spoke seditious words on the platform, but rather that the middle classes were scared of them, and that they caused terror to the peaceful inhabitants. And that's quite an important shift in attitudes. By the time of the Chartist trials in 1839, to quote Lobban, prosecutions combined concepts of unlawful assembly, conspiracy and riots in a way that hadn't been done before 1820, although arguably there's precedence in the Golden Riots trials of 1780. So that's my kind of framework for this period and what I think is going on in terms of the loyalist reaction and the legislation. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the chapters. But why is this important? Well, I think public space is quite an issue in the past 5-10 years in terms of protest more generally, and I think the issue of control over public space is particularly highlighted by some of the 21st century movements. The most obvious tactic of protest movements is to occupy space, and the most obvious example of that is the Occupy movement with a capital O, which in the winter of 2011 erected tents across civic squares and battled over seemingly public space, but what was actually private space owned by private corporations or private bodies, and wasn't open to the public in some of the usual ways. So contemporary commentators such as Anna Minton have commented about these malls without walls or open-air commercial or private spaces that seem to signify public because they've got benches and sculptures and fountains and they don't have gates on them, but actually are patrolled by private security forces, not the police, who are accountable, and they decide who is a member of that public and who's not. So someone who, for example, a big issue seller or someone giving out leaflets who would be illegal in a public space is made illegal in these private spaces, even though actually visually, distinctively, they don't look that dissimilar. And in 2014 there was an outcry against defensible architecture used against homeless people, so the sort of so-called spikes, and something a bit closer to my heart, the sort of gating off of Manchester Library Walk on the site of Peterloo, which was stopping up a footpath essentially illegally, was another sort of indication of how contested public space can be, and who has the right to close off public space. These issues were just the same in the early 19th century through debates about improvement. Improvement of the built environment essentially rocketed in the late 18th, early 19th century, where local authorities were pressing for parliamentary legislation to enable not only sewers and water pipes and gas lamps and civic amenities to be built, but also to write into the bylaws more tougher restrictions on beggars and vagrants and undesirables. There's quite a lot about loitering in these improvement acts, and I've got a section in my book about how later on, particularly trade unions deliberately loiter in contravention of these bylaws in order to annoy the local special constables who on Chelsea pensions have been sent to leave them on. And indeed the rural police, or county police force, who were set up in 1839, are renowned for the policy of moving on. It's called Move On, the policy, where you're basically not allowed to loiter in the street anymore. And the Chartists in particular contest that, and also trade unions just stand around. But they can't be, I've gone off topic now, but they can't be arrested for seditious meeting either, because there's no one organising the meeting, they're just standing around loitering. So improvement becomes this kind of tool of social control. I'm not arguing that it's complete or hegemonic here, but we do have lots of examples where people feel excluded from public spaces. So the map is not legible at all, but it's of Leeds, and I've just taken the example of Park Street and Park Square, which is still quite a well-to-do sort of part of the business area of Leeds, if you know the city. It was built in the late 18th century, surrounded by St Paul's Church in St Paul's Square, which is an exclusive church for the local merchants and wool manufacturers who had exclusive burial rights there, and there's a courthouse and a new exchange and commercial buildings which were deliberately meant to symbolise the new wealth of the liberal manufacturers in the woolen industry. A little later they get an improvement act to knock down the Moot Hall and all the medieval buildings off Briggate. And that was, for them, was deliberately, and you can read the papers about this. The Leeds Mercury goes on about how antiquated and associated with the old Tory regime were these old buildings, whereas these new commercial buildings represented the new Whig Liberal control over the government and the wealth of the town. And a lot of these areas have gated off, just like today. So still some squares in Leeds are surrounded by iron railings from this. And what I found when I've been looking at where meetings are held is that there are no meetings in squares held in Leeds, and I think that's because they're all gated off. Whereas somewhere like Sheffield or Manchester have open squares where you can just walk in, and therefore the Chartists or radicals or trade unions have meetings in squares in all the northern towns. I must say also here, I haven't looked at the south of England, I've just looked at northern England, apologies. But certainly Leeds seems to have that sense of exclusivity where people are physically excluded from meeting in the new civic squares. So working class movements are what I've called resource poor. William Sewell, the sociologist, uses this term resource poor, where they're unable to compete with ruling elites who have control over the spaces. And therefore they're forced to meet in what I've called spaces of making do. So I've just selected a couple of Chartist posters from the National Archives there. They're meeting on the back of building grounds, scrubland. They're hiring sort of quite rough, falling down warehouses, that kind of thing, for meetings. They also meet in sympathetic places like primitive Methodist chapels seem to be quite common for meeting in, and any space that they can find that is available to them. But I argue that increasingly the more the civic buildings are built, in specifically town halls actually, the fewer places are available in city centres, town centres for these groups to meet in. And a lot of the conflict is over whether they can meet in a town hall. Earlier town halls are built by subscription and therefore are technically private spaces. Later town halls after the 1830s are built with rates, and so particularly the Chartists and the all-night Socialists argue that they should have the right to hold meetings in those areas because they paid for them by their rates. But again, this is always contested. And every time that they try to hire a meeting room, there's this kind of rigmarole of negotiation where you put a request in and there's counter request. Someone produces an address, particularly if it's to do with, I don't know, a king's birthday or something, or Queen's sort of coronation, and there'll be a counter address, and it will go on like this. That's the movement of civic politics in some senses. Actually, it's quite civil. But that's where popular politics is enacted in the grassroots. It's these contests. So local elites attempt to impose control over public and private spaces through improvement. They also, I've talked quite a bit about rural areas and enclosure. Increasingly a lot of rural areas are enclosed. Public parks. There's a quite sort of new work about public parks in this era, in the Victorian era. Those are also essentially enclosed spaces where you can't hold meetings because the park warden will kick you out. But I also argue that protesters aren't devoid of agency, and in fact their agency comes in the more creative ways that they try and get around all these restrictions. It's already creative trying to find these new spaces, and there's two ways that they do that. One of which is build their own buildings, which I'll come to later. The other is to physically combat the restrictions on the ability to meet, which I'll talk about now. I quite like Fran Tonkis, who was in the sociological study of modern social movements, in a book called Space, the City and Social Theory, which came out about 10 years ago. And she highlights the kind of forms of spatial knowledge that social movements have, and particularly sort of highlights how the more, quote, the more fraught, contested or threatening the urban scene, the more crucial street wisdom becomes as a spatial strategy. So the latter part of the book talks about essentially how protest movements use guerrilla warfare. And they do use that word guerrilla, and the commanders of the Northern District, Sir Charles James Napier, and his compatriot military commanders have mainly served in the peninsula during the Napoleonic Wars, so they were aware of this term guerrilla and what it means, and they apply that to describe battles over the streets essentially during the key sort of periods of rising, particularly in 1812, but also in 1839, 42 and 48. So I'm going to take us all the way to the last chapter in 1848 and look at one particular street battle, which is the Battle of Adelaide Street in Bradford. The military have already had a lot of trouble in Bradford. It seems to be one of the most troublesome places. The anti-New Poor Law movement has some of its most violent riots in Bradford. There's the so-called Yorkshire Rising of 1839 has quite a lot of adherents in Bradford, and there's quite a lot of scuffles, and there's some very interesting descriptions of Napier trying to send his cavalry up the steep streets of Bradford. If you know Bradford, the streets are the gradient's very high, is that right? And they're all cobbled, and obviously it's raining because it's Yorkshire, So there's lots of descriptions of the horses slipping on these cobbles, and all the streets that go up the hill, up towards Forster Square, if you know Bradford. The Chartists and the Irish are hiding in the alleyways perpendicular to these streets and are just chucking brickbats at the horses and causing them to fall. Quite violent. So the military are aware of this, so I don't know why they make the same mistake again, essentially, in 1848. But it is seen as guerrilla warfare in these points of crisis. So this comes from a chapter called Making Moscows. Making a Moscow is quite a common term, again, that Samuel Holbury uses and various other Chartist leaders use for physical force risings. And I must say here that Bradford had the highest proportion of Irish-born inhabitants in Yorkshire, estimated by the Poor Law Union clerk at about 20,000, which is about a sixth of the population. And they're particularly affected by the economic downturn of 1847-1848. And the number of paupers increases, and it's exacerbated by the introduction of more machinery in the woolen industry in 1848. So tensions are high. They were already stoked up by, again, previous agitation over the new Poor Law, and there's also a battle in terms of authority, and I think this is the crucial bit to why the military make the mistakes that they do, is that the Bradford's been undergoing an incorporation battle between the Tories and the Whigs with Liberals. So the authority about who is in charge is still essentially not decided. The Liberals have only just taken over from the Tories on the council. And the Bradford Chartist council are particularly strong and have firm links with the Irish Confederates, who are by this time mustering a National Guard. So we can see that the crisis point is forming, and where if there ever would be a Chartist general rising, it would start, I think, in Bradford. So on Monday morning, 29th of May 1848, the police superintendent led 100 special constables into the Manchester Road area, which is what is on the map, but it's slightly anachronistic because I couldn't find a contemporary map, so that's from the 1890s, so it looks a bit different from that. You can't see it anyway, so it doesn't matter. And they were on a mission to arrest two local radical leaders, David Lightfowler and the blacksmith Iron Jefferson, known as Wat Tyler. You can tell what sort of person he was, who were accused of making pikes for the suspected Confederate rising. This area in particular was a warren of courts and alleys, and I think this is where the local communities are trying to reclaim their areas back from improvement, if you like. There have been a fair number of historians who've studied the Adelaide Street riots. So John Saville and John Belcham stated that this was Irish woolcombers riot, and I thought about that and thought, well, is this just about sectarian tension between an English police and Irish woolcombers? But I looked back at the 1851 census for this area, and I found a much more varied picture. So woolcombers do form the greatest number of householders in the area. 50 out of 95 heads of household are woolcombers. But I found only 27 heads of household had been born in Ireland, and there's English households door to door with the English, and quite a few of those English householders were from Devon and Wiltshire, which suggests to me that they were woolcombers and wool workers who'd escaped the depression in the West Country woolen industry earlier and moved up to Yorkshire for jobs. So actually this is quite a mixed locale. So I like looking at this term locale, because I think it tells us quite a lot about a community and where pinpoints of action happen. So it was actually relatively economically and socially mixed in terms of this isn't the poorest of the poor Irish woolcombers. There is quite a mix of ethnicities here at least. But essentially what happens is that they send the military in to try and arrest the two Chartists. The Chartists escape out the back windows, and know the shortcuts, so they escape. The military have to retreat back to the courthouse. But rather than waiting for the agitation then to calm down, the Lord Lieutenant, Earl Harwood, and then the Major General of the military decide to nip the problem in the bud with a show of force. And they do a second round of the rout. And I think this shows that this is a battle for territory and the determination of both sides to claim ground. So 4 o'clock that afternoon, the authorities order the whole of the police force armed with cutlasses, 2 troops of dragoons, 200 infantry, 1,000 special constables, and the magistrates and the mayor, and they parade in sort of a victory triumph out of the courthouse, down through Bradford to this area, which is slightly south of Bradford. And forgetting the fact that essentially this area is about 4 streets of quite dense terraced houses and courtyards. So you've got probably about 2,000 people trying to cram in to 4 streets. And what happens is that the special constables are severely beaten and driven back, but the authorities make a tactical mistake in placing the military behind the special constables. So essentially they get stopped on both sides of these quite narrow terraces by the communities that live there, who just chuck cobbles and stones and brickbats out of their windows and out of the courtyards, and severely injure quite a large number of the authorities. The police essentially get stuck on Adelaide Street and are just sitting duck and target. The cavalry eventually dispersed the crowds, but not before the newspapers could pick out the obligatory Amazon defending her patch. So Mary Mortimer, good old Mary Mortimer, was arrested in the doorway after, quote, having tossed stones with the greatest intrepidity and fierceness, swore like a trooper, and declared that she was a Chartist and would die like a Chartist. 17 prisoners were taken to the courthouse, and the military marched back again out of the kind of battered and bruised, but in terms of the victory parade. The newspapers again comment on the effects on the topography of Bradford. Spectators were able to watch from further up the hill, and crowds at the end of every street were watching the movements of the invading forces. This is to quote the Bradford Observer, the invading forces who had just established a sort of military law in their dominions. The coming together of these different authorities actually solved the problem of the incorporation dispute, and the old Tory gentry in fact made a peaceful alliance with the new Liberal Whig Woolcombers. The Bradford mayor, Robert Milligan, was a self-made Liberal radical and dissenter who, notwithstanding the previous decade of party disputes, felt compelled to stand in defence alongside Joshua Pollard, who was a major county magistrate and Tory landowner. And the gap between the elite and the populace was demonstrated, I think, quite physically as well as party politically, in this defence of property against the occupation by working classes. So, quickly, some questions from that then. Is this just a kind of moment of desperation at the end of quite a long period of economic depression and Chartist attrition? Was it just simple self-preservation against arrest, or was it more than that? I went back to Theodore, I can never say his name, Kodicek's study of Bradford, and he puts forward a Marxist framework over what was going on in Bradford at this time, and he saw the riots as reflective of a retreat and a defeat of the working class. He noted in spatial terms, with industrialisation of the old hinterland villages and the enclosure of traditional fairgrounds on which working class radicals from the entire region had gathered a decade before, the fully urbanised Chartists of 1848 were thrown back almost entirely on their own resources and confined to their downtown residential slums. Here at least the writ of the Liberal municipality did not yet run. They could defiantly reenact the gestures of control over their lives and environment that they had ceased to exercise within the larger framework of capitalist life. The opinion of Kodicek was pessimistic. He was searching for the fulfilment of Marx's predictions in 1848, but compared with what was going on the continent, he saw the working class as too artisan, too backward-looking, and not proletarian enough. Quote, for here at least the 1848 charge to the barricades represented not the first flowering of the industrial workers of the future, but the last gasp of a dying generation of proletarianised artisans who were de-skilled and degraded by the triumph of capitalist productive relations, but whose visions of communitarian social alternative remain trapped within the now bankrupt values of a bygone proto-industrial past. Okay, I'll challenge that now quickly in 10 minutes that I've got left. I've been reading a lot of geography, unfortunately. So I've been coming to this from a kind of historical geography and labour geography perspective, which I think can give us some more optimistic conclusions to where Kodyszek left off. We've got to talk about David Harvey. In Social Justice and the City, which was published in 1973, Harvey explored the urban processes under capitalism and argued that understanding the nature of space is integral to understanding these processes. And he comes up with this quite influential tripartite theory of space, which is also picked up by other theories like Lefebvre and Sawyer about absolute relation and relational space. I'm not going to go into that here because it ends up becoming this kind of theoretical flight of fancy, I think. I think it has a point in terms of situating time in space and saying, well, he was answering the question, what does Tiananmen Square mean? And he said you can't understand that without understanding the absolute space of where it is compared with the relation to space of what the symbolism of that space means compared with its space in time in terms of the dates that events happened in Tiananmen Square. So you have to have a sort of triangle of understanding of space. Doreen Massey also considered the geographies of production and capitalism in her spatial divisions of labour, which originally came out in 1984. And she conceptualised capital as a series of social relations between its instruments. So she argues that capitalism has an uneven geography because, again, the owners of production obviously can build lots of buildings, be it firms or branch plants, and they are the people who decide how many jobs there are. And so the geographies of production are uneven. I think we've moved on a bit since then, and we'll sort of skip over to more recent labour geography, which I think is a bit more fruitful in trying to understand what's going on in my period. And I'm still quite keen on Doreen Massey and also her followers. So her more recent book, For Space, argues against Harvey's view that you should just look at space as a slice in time. And she argues about this term which I keep mentioning, inclusion and exclusion. And she looks particularly at another issue to do with this period, which is the Enclosure Acts and the swing rights in the 1830s, and argues that you can't understand those without understanding lots of different layers of space, and that what enclosure writers are doing and swing writers are doing in their protests is not local protectionism, it's a critique of dispossession. And what they're being dispossessed from is not only their localities but a larger global production system. And what they're defending their livelihoods against is sort of the move to Smithian economics and free trade, which threatens to take away individual skill and worth in the labour-saving machines that cheapen the production of cloth or threshing corn, in huge factories that reduced workers to the state of anonymous hands rather than skilled labourers, and also reduced them to the invisible hand of the market without the right to form a trade union or state intervention to ensure a fair wage or decent working conditions. It also affects paupers in the fact that the workhouses now reduce them to the state of paupers who are able-bodied or impotent, and that in effect this means that Luddites or swing writers or trade unions or Chartists were not reactionary, sort of visionary, looking for a kind of golden age in the past, but were seeking a different economic solution, a different meaning of progress that valued representation of the non-represented and valued some legislative restrictions on what governing elites and employers could do. And then finally, sort of another sort of key influence that I think explains a lot about the question of local versus global in this is more recent work by David Featherstone, who's one of Massey's former students. And he's done quite a lot of work on the London Corresponding Society in the 1790s, also the Wilkes riots of the 1760s, but he also works on anti-globalisation movements of contemporary era. And he went back to Harvey, and bear with me, he's arguing against Harvey's arguments against Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams' term militant particularism, I think, is quite important here. And it relates again to what Mass is saying about critiquing dispossession. Williams looked at labour relations in the Cowley car factory in Oxford in the 1960s and found that local particularism, local conflicts were embedded in organising those conflicts. David Harvey interpreted this interpretation as the idea that successful movements move beyond local conflicts and move beyond militant particularism, and they can only achieve class consciousness once they look more globally, and that you can't achieve class consciousness if you are looking at a local struggle and a local strike. David Featherstone and his other compatriots argue against this limited version of militant particularism, and they're interested in this Massey's ideas of lots of layers of how things are connected. So they argue for a much more wider conception of resistance that includes the local and the global together. So I'll quote Massey on this just to explain what I mean. So she says, we could follow the story of the dispossession of the land under the Enclosure Acts through Thomas Spence and his call for parish ownership, and from there across the Atlantic, for example, to Jamaica, where William Cobbett's register was circulating amongst free slaves and had published Spence's plan. Spence had written in defence of indigenous land ownership in the USA and knew of battles of indigenous peoples in Central America. So wherever you've got a local conflict, you'll be able to find a global conflict a few steps along the line. And I think that's how I'd like to interpret certainly what was going on in 1848, particularly in terms of the connections with the Irish Confederates. So quite a few of these Irish who were defending their local street literally a few feet were also defending the ideals of the Irish Confederates, who were also connected with the Americans over in New York, who were also connected with various anti-slavery movements further south in America. So wherever you're looking at a local conflict, I think you can find much broader connections. Now, it's not to say that every person involved in defending their house against a police constable coming to arrest them will be aware of that, but certainly as we're looking as historians, you have to look at what the geographers called a multi-scalar geography of resistance. And so the barricades are also quite influential. We've got treacle laws being raised in these locales, these specific locales on lampposts, which again a nod to the French. Again, maybe they're doing that just to shock the authorities, but at least the knowledge is there. Okay, so I've run out of time now, but what I'd like to say is that I'd like to sort of show you at least that there is a sense of continuity across the whole period from the 1790s to 1848. I do think that unfortunately we have to be a bit pessimistic, and the authorities do get the upper hand by the end of 1848. Essentially the Chartists in particular run out of money, which is a huge and perhaps understated reason why essentially the movement fizzles out by the 1850s. But they do achieve a lot greater level of success than their predecessors could ever have hoped, and ditto the all-night socialists, particularly in building buildings. So I won't have time to show you that, but I've also talked a bit about these halls of science and all the new buildings that they built, which I think are a huge achievement, even if they didn't last very long. The fact that they could physically build some buildings of their own to me is really important. And that although there is a sort of sense of loss and looking back at a sort of golden age perhaps of a mythical constitution, of a common land and landscapes open to all, that kind of myth of the freeborn Englishman. Eventually, these groups, particularly Chartists and the all-out Socialists, are able to find creative and important ways of contesting the increasing restrictions that both local and national government have placed on their freedom to meet and to speak.